question for you. I want to go back to
Cassidy.
something basic that you said. I think this is from the introduction. I have to check the page number here. Yeah, it's early in the book, page 10, but it sets up your entire book. Obviously, it's the introduction. As I reflected on the steadily growing rot in the American project, it became clear that a common factor lay behind the national breakdown. And then you talk about the national breakdown of trust. Trust, the essential bond that holds any society together, was unraveling. And basically every chapter in your book after that, whether it's journalism or the media or even medical practice, you chart in each chapter very well, I think, and very convincingly, the breakdown in trust. It would surprise me if anybody who read this book from any kind of reasonable point of view would disagree with your analysis of the breakdown of trust. We all know that has happened. Of course, we always want to point to someone else. Oh, Donald Trump did the whole thing, but if you're from the left or from the right, the liberals, blah, 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 blah. But you have a sort of a different point of view. You say, on the one hand, the elites, the new establishment, expensively educated, versed in all the modern progressive nostrums of the age on American culture, society, and history. For this group, who comprise much of the nation's political leadership, almost its entire academic establishment, most of the people who control its news and cultural output, and a good deal of its corporate elite, the United States has never escaped its legacy of being an irredeemably malignant force for oppression and privilege. This modern elite rejects the idea that America has been a great force for good. And that's a paragraph that not only I think is well put together and reflects your whole book, but it's one I would agree with, in the sense that, having been raised in Europe, and I was born in 1952, my parents ran a mission. In that mission were many escapees from the East Bloc. Marika arrived with her feet bloody and bandaged because she had crawled over snow and barbed wire to get to the West. I listened to the tanks rolling into Prague, et cetera, et cetera. I'm old enough to remember a world in which there were people grateful all over Europe, even in France, believe it or not, who would come up and say, you're an American. The only reason we have our country is because of your countrymen. Thank you. Tell you one tiny little anecdote. I met a young French girl about 12 years ago. Jeannie and I were walking in France in an area where there were cave dwellings in the old days, and she was on a farm about 11. We got to know her and her family, and about 3 years later, out of the blue, I get a little file of sand, and from this lovely child, who by that time was probably 15, and she said, my parents and I were on Omaha Beach, and I wanted to send you this sand from where your countrymen bled and died for my country. That's also America. So I totally agree with you. I hate the idea that we now can't even say that America was a force for good in anything it's ever done, that it's all about oppression and minorities, it's all about this, that, and the other. Last little point I'll make, it shows such a lack of understanding of a history. I'll just point to one thing. You want to talk about colonialism? What about the Ottoman Empire? Right. At the gates of Vienna trying to invade Europe? What about the entire North African continent that is nothing except an Arab invasion from the deserts, spreading Islam by the sword, never by evangelism? The problem is that oppression has always been there, but the idea that it's the focus of a white kind of North American or European nationalism is just absurd, just from the point of view of history. Sorry for the sermon, but I'd like you to really take us there.
I so agree with everything you said. Let me just give you one other very brief anecdote. That's a very moving anecdote you give. I'll give you one. I lived in Japan for several years, covering Japan for the Financial Times, and several of my colleagues were Japanese, and I remember one of them telling me that her father had one of his most vivid memories of he was quite young, he was a boy, I suppose, towards the end of the Second World War, the American occupation of Japan after Japan had surrendered. Her father remembers that they lived in sort of Western Japan or something. That's the first time they saw American forces. They came through the village, the town where he lived, and they were in trucks. And as they were going through the village, they were throwing boxes out of the back of the truck. And initially the kids all ran away. Remember Japan again. Sure. Japan's a great country, but when Japan went and invaded another country and occupied another country, it raped and pillaged and murdered and bayoneted people and killed literally millions of people. That's what they did. The Americans came to Japan. They were throwing these boxes out. The kids thought, oh my God, is it a bomb? Is it some sort of poison? What is it? And after a while, a couple of the kids, my friend's father, had the sort of bravery of the kids' bravery to go up and start opening the boxes, and it was boxes of chocolate. Yeah. And I find that a very moving story that
Yeah,
captures
absolutely.
how different America, and I must say, Britain too, has been. That's not, so the idea, that's what so offends me about this idea that all American history is just all American, is a history of oppression, when actually more people in the world today owe their liberty, owe their life to the fact that Americans were willing to fight and die, um, for America. Obviously, that was their primary obligation, but for the very ideas that America was founded on. So that is the problem. And look, by the way, of course, it's necessary to say this. None of that is to say that America has
Right.
a pure history. I mean, God
Right.
knows and one of the things I find really frustrating when I talk to people about this is this idea that somehow Americans it's only in the last 10 years since the sort of critical race theory and DEI movements have grown up that Americans have been taught about slavery or the Civil War. I mean, I'm English. I'm I'm over 60 years old. I was educated in 19 as a small child in the 60s and then 70s. We learned about we knew what the Civil War was about, and Pache, Nikki Haley. We knew what was going on. We knew that we knew what slavery was. We knew what an abomination it was, how evil it was. I
Yeah.
don't think there are many Americans, if I may be so bold, who
Mm.
grew up thinking somehow, well, slavery, wasn't a bad thing, states' rights and all that kind of stuff. Everybody knows how terrible slavery was and what a sin it was, and how the stain of that sin, I'm not denying that either, continues to infect America today. I say, by the way, to some of my more passionate conservative friends who think America has solved the race problem, I say to them, in my lifetime, again, I'm 60, just over 60, in my lifetime, there were parts of America where, African Americans were literally not allowed to step in the same place, ride the same bus, be in the same school. Do you honestly think, I mean, are we really making that much progress that sin, that crime, that discrimination has been completely extirpated? So I don't need any convincing that America is not perfect, that America has particularly on the issue of race, a terrible, terrible historical stain that it continues to have to work out. But it is, I think, willfully myopic to suggest that no progress has been made, which is kind of
even contemporary issues that supposedly are such a big deal, just take gay rights. It's not a coincidence that the United States was far ahead of most other countries in the world and still is today.
So
yes,
Europe, by the way.
yeah, much more ahead of
social democratic
liberal,
Europe. Yeah.
liberal left-wing Europe. I mean, the states led the way on gay rights, gay marriage, a whole bunch of things that are part of the progressive gospel. And even there, and I remember John Updike making a point in an article he wrote for the New Yorker a while before he died, saying, okay, we can complain about the US and a lot of things. And this was sort of on feminism, but just saying, it wasn't an accident that this is where the modern feminism you all subscribe to in order to criticize the patriarchy as an American capitalist phenomena.
Right.
Who do you think opened the door to this being a thing? Sort of what I would call the Gandhi principle of, yes, Winston Churchill was terrible about India, maybe, and there was the racism and the empire. But on the other hand, I can't think of another imperial power that wouldn't have just shot Gandhi.
Right. Right. Yeah, no, I mean, all of that's
people don't have any sense of the history of it.
No, exactly. And that's the important point, I think, that again, of course, we can acknowledge the crimes that were committed, not just the individual crimes, but the if you like, the kind of the collective crime, the state crime, that tolerated slavery, that tolerated discrimination well after slavery, Jim Crow, and for decades and decades, and also, and I will go this far, continues to tolerate levels of discrimination today that it shouldn't tolerate. But of course, we must keep that in mind. But where the kind of mental corruption occurs is when we allow that crime, that stain, to override everything else that the United States supposedly has ever done and stood for, and to indict the United States, and America, and as you say, to some extent, Britain, for that reason. By the way, just in passing, I say, and I'm glad to say, finally, Britain is now finally, after all this, after the whole monument destruction process that we've been through in the last few years, Britain, as you well know, Frank, not only abolished the slave trade, obviously abolished slavery and abolished the slave trade before the United States. Britain enforced the abolition of the slave trade with thousands and thousands and thousands of Royal Navy people, servicemen being killed enforce stopping the slave trade. And you know, we literally, thanks to Britain alone, I should say, no one else, African countries weren't helping out. No European countries were helping out. In the 19th century, millions and millions of people were saved from slavery and their descendants because the Royal Navy, because the British government insisted on barring slavery. And finally, they were erecting a monument to those people in Britain this year. So look, so all I'm saying is, we cannot look at America's history, what it stood for, how it was created, the founding fathers, their ideas. Of course, we can acknowledge that, you know, that many of them had slaves, and we can acknowledge the fundamental flaws that they almost all had, and the sin that again that was there very much present at the foundation. We can acknowledge all of that without rejecting the greatness of American virtues and values and what America has done for Americans, but also for the world.